the test. Progressive action in terms of our survival is of paramount importance. The Wake Up Call brings you dynamic, forward-thinking concepts each Monday and Friday at 10 a.m. so you can plan your future, sidestep the ravages of the Depression. You have to be aware of what's going on. Then, armed with knowledge, you can use the Wake Up Call and the Progressive Radio Network to forge an exit strategy. The Progressive Radio Network is moving forward. We hope you're coming with us.
The Progressive Radio News Hour features in-depth discussions and full disclosure of cutting-edge world and national issues. Distinguished guests explain them, taking aim at policies harming so many people worldwide. Change comes through understanding and a commitment to something better. The Progressive Radio News Hour is dedicated to working for it by providing listeners with vital information they need to know. Listen Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, as well as Saturdays and Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The Progressive Radio Network is moving forward, and we hope you're coming with us.
You are listening to the Progressive Radio Network, your source for news and information.
Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host Mitchell J. Rabin, and I know you didn't hear the Mozart that you are accustomed to hearing, as am I, but through a little transformation of consciousness, we ended up with another piece of music to introduce today. However, Mozart soon will be back, and a little bit later on the show you will be hearing a very interesting song related directly to the subject of today's show, which is genetically modified organisms, understanding what they are, who makes them, why, and what we may want to do about it. So to guide us along this path is a world-renowned expert in the subject, Jeffrey Smith, who has written the two best-selling books on the subject. He is the author of these two books, both Seeds of Deception, which many of you may know, and Genetic Roulette, which describes the health dangers of genetically modified organisms. He has conducted literally meticulous research documenting how the biotech companies have continued to mislead legislators and, of course, the public as well as safety officials about the health risk of the GMOs to society as well as to the environment, not to mention actually the gene pool altogether. So we're going to be focusing on this. Jeffrey has gone around the world discussing all of this with governments, government officials from different countries across Asia, Europe, etc. He has been on nationally televised programs, including not that long ago, The Oz Show, and now he is on A Better World Radio and soon as well TV. So welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, what is it that got you interested in this whole subject? I mean, everybody is generally interested, but you've become like a laser beam interested. What is it that first inspired you in this direction?
Well, it was a lecture from a scientist, and the scientist was a molecular biologist and knew the details of genetic engineering and knew how unsafe and unpredictable it was. He knew that we were babes in the woods and toying with the most fundamental level of biology, whose ramifications were unprecedented. I mean, we're about to release the products of this infant science into the food supply, affecting everyone who eats, into the environment where the genes could never be recalled. The self-propagating pollution of the gene pool could outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. And he was going through the very detailed information as to why the technology wasn't safe. And he was doing it in scientific terms. And I was getting it, but I realized that no one else was going to be getting this information. This was in 1996, just before they were planting GMOs, and I was in Iowa, and that's where I live, and they were going to plant GMOs throughout Iowa, and they were going to feed us throughout the world.
For the corn.
For the corn and the soy. And I realized people need to hear this. And they need to hear it in a way that they'll understand it and appreciate it, not necessarily in the intense scientific terms, but translate it a bit. And so I started immediately interviewing him and others and translating what they were saying into articles and speeches and brochures. And later I worked at a GMO detection laboratory as the VP of Marketing Communications. And then I released Seeds of Deception in 2003.
You were obviously just outraged at the audacity of putting into the food supply, as you said, totally untested material into no less the gene pool itself, which once altered may never be able to be altered back to its original condition.
It was, there was a sense of awe that any group or company was arrogant enough to do this. I mean, some of the deployments of technology have been a disaster, but they've essentially been recallable or fixable, even if it takes decades. Here, they were willing to risk all living beings and all future generations on a technology which the scientists knew was unsafe. The scientists knew it was unsafe. And so later, when I was doing research, back in 1998, friends of mine sued the FDA for approving GMOs, and it forced the FDA to make its files public. 44,000 secret internal memos were made public about GMOs, and it showed that even the scientists at the FDA said the same thing that independent scientists were saying, that the technology is unsafe. It's full of unpredicted side effects, and they enumerated toxins, allergens, nutritional problems, new diseases, and said these need to be tested carefully. But we didn't know this at the time when the GMOs were approved. They were approved en masse. In 1992, the policy said, we're not aware of any information showing that GMOs are significantly different, completely lying about the actual situation that was going on in the agency itself.
On what science, Jeffrey, did the FDA originally base their approval on?
Well, they used the word substantially equivalent. It was an unscientific term. It was just introduced for the purpose, and it basically said if it's a tomato and it's a genetically engineered tomato, well, they're basically the same. So we don't have to regulate a tomato, and we don't have to regulate a genetically modified tomato because it's substantially equivalent. So what does substantially equivalent mean? They never defined it. They just called it that as a kind of a public relations term. And the excuse was, in a sentence, the agency is not aware of any information showing foods created by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, period. That was the excuse for saying no safety studies needed, no labeling needed. Companies like Monsanto that gave us PCBs, Agent Orange, and DDT, and told us that they were all safe, can determine if GMOs are safe and not even tell the FDA they can put it on the market without any safety studies or labeling.
So in short, the only science that was conducted prior to the initial approval was conducted by Monsanto itself, and then language, it sounds, was cooked up like substantially equivalent by their legal staff.
Essentially, it's not just Monsanto, there's a few others too.
Sure.
But there was no independent studies at the beginning.
And the FDA does not conduct their own science themselves.
No, in fact, they concocted what was called a voluntary consultation process as a facade to say that the government is involved in it, but it's really technically known as a meaningless exercise, because, if you wanted to have a consultation, you could write up whatever you want. You could submit 10 pages, you could submit 1,000 pages. It could be summary data, and you could say, this is what I'm submitting. If they say, can you add this and this and this, and you say no. Now, at the end of the exercise, they never say, your food is safe. They never say it's approved. They send you a letter which says, you believe your foods are safe, and that's to remind you that that's your responsibility, and that you believe that there's nothing of interest for the FDA to actually evaluate it, and to evaluate the science and to approve it.
So what's the purpose of the FDA being there to write such a letter?
It's basically a facade. It's basically a kind of a smokescreen so that other countries will have the false impression that the FDA approved it and looked at it carefully and meticulously, and therefore those countries don't have to. And it's for the consumers to believe, well, the FDA has approved it and is looking for our safety. Now, why did the FDA have this completely hands-off policy? It turns out that the first Bush administration, under George H., told the regulatory agencies, including the FDA, promote biotechnology. And so the FDA created a new position specifically for Michael Taylor, who was Monsanto's attorney, brought him into the FDA to be in charge of policy while this FDA GMO policy was being created. Now, Taylor oversaw this policy, gave a green light to GMOs without any studies, then went to the USDA to work on GMO policy, then became Monsanto's vice president, and now the Obama administration put him back in the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. So the person I believe is responsible for more food-related illnesses and deaths than anyone in human history is now in charge of the U.S. food safety.
Mon Dieu. Incredible. Nothing like the wolf watching the hen house. I mean, so let's just establish that the FDA does not do. Now, many of our audience members really already know this. I mean, after all, they listen to Progressive Radio Network, they listen to Gary Null, they listen to Mitchell Rabin, they've listened to a lot of people around here for many, many years. So for some, this is old news, but for others, it's not. And it needs to be very clearly established that the FDA, according to your meticulous research, Jeffrey, has shown that it allows foods, genetically modified and otherwise, as well as any number of different pharmaceutical agents onto the market without doing, number one, their own science, and they take the word of the scientists who have a vested interest in the outcome from the corporations themselves.
Now get this,
pass as the legitimate science.
And with pharmaceuticals, there's a four-phase thing. First you study rats, then you study healthy humans, and then there's a whole way you do pharmaceuticals.
A protocol.
Right, and in a couple of years of approving drugs, it turns out more than half of them had to be either withdrawn or labeled more seriously problematic than the FDA had originally approved. So even with all those $500 million of studies per drug, they still get it wrong. But the FDA has no required safety studies with GMOs. And the quality of the safety studies that are done by industry is basically tobacco science. They have bad science down to a science. And they rig their research in such careful ways, and we've exposed them. I mean, we've exposed how they use the wrong detection methods, the wrong samples. They don't even test their own GM crops. They concoct something with genetically modified bacteria to say that the corn is safe. I mean, what they violate is simply scandalous. I mean, we pointed out, there's a whole section in Genetic Roulette which shows how they've lied. And unfortunately, the regulators around the world are largely staffed by the people put in those positions by the biotech industry. I've seen it in country after country as I travel around the world.
So you're saying that the largest biotech corporations that might be United States based or not have staffed the respective FDAs per country across the world?
When I say staffed, I mean they got their people. They're not necessarily, not like always Michael Taylor where they actually come from.
Not necessarily on the commissioner level.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, in Brazil and India and Europe, we see that there's pro-biotech scientists who are often financially connected to the biotech industry, and they will rubber stamp approvals, oftentimes without even reading the files. And there's a small handful of independent scientists, and I've spoken to many of them, that pull their hair out in frustration saying, there's a side effect here, there's a side effect here, that's completely ignored. In India, there was a petition in front of the Supreme Court, and so the Supreme Court asked one of the top biologists in the world, P.M. Bhargava, to be on the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee and to evaluate its approval process after 10 months. He asked for an immediate moratorium on GMOs. He said it's completely a sham. That wasn't his words, it was my words. What he said was they don't evaluate any negative impact. He would bring in articles and material, and they would always say, oh, that's been discredited and that's been discredited. They wouldn't even read some of the submissions. And he told the Prime Minister and the Health Minister and the Supreme Court that there's not a single GMO in the world that's been properly evaluated by any country, by any scientist. And he laid out what needed to be done, and it was a far cry from what had been done. In fact, only about 10% of the categories that needed to be investigated had been done, but it had been done by industry themselves, and he said that was basically worthless. So we have basically an unregulated abdication of regulation when it comes to GMOs. Now, that's the basis in terms of the fact that no one is watching. What we're now discovering as we look at the few studies that have been done, it validates and verifies the concerns by the scientists. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine says every doctor in America should prescribe to every patient, don't eat GMOs. They say the GMOs in animal feeding studies have linked to reproductive problems, immune system problems, organ damage, accelerated aging, lots of situations where...
Low sperm count.
Low sperm count. I mean, we see low sperm count, in fact, with Roundup, which is the herbicide used on most genetically modified crops. Let's back up here a minute. The reason why they genetically modify crops is primarily to allow them not to die when sprayed with herbicide. So you have Roundup-ready soybeans, and they can be sprayed with Roundup. Liberty Link corn to be sprayed with Liberty. This is the reason why these chemical companies, like Monsanto, genetically engineer in order to sell more chemical. And that chemical ends up in the plant, inside the food portion. You can't wash it off, and we eat it. Now, the second reason is to put an insecticide into corn and cotton, and hopefully they want other products, we don't. And that insecticide is designed to break open the stomach of insects and kill them, and it's inside the food, and it can't be washed off, and we eat it. So we have evidence showing that both of these categories, the herbicide tolerant and the pesticide producers, I call them the poison drinkers and the poison producers, are dangerous for human consumption, dangerous for animal consumption, should never have been approved, and should not be eaten.
And yet they are approved and they're in circulation literally worldwide, but let's just talk about this country, and they're not labeled. So we'll get to that in a moment. Let's just look at the overall purport of the biotech industry about why these exist, besides the, of course, profit motive. There's a myth, which is, maybe you can elaborate, that in order to feed the number of billions of people we have on this planet, we need genetically modified foods. Talk about that.
This is the public relations spin, and it's not even believed by the people who work at the companies. I talked to a former Monsanto employee, Kirk Azevedo, and he had been recruited to sell Monsanto's cotton, genetically engineered. And what he did is he studied the company and read the words of the CEO, Robert Shapiro, and was completely moved by all the fantastic things that GMOs were going to do. And so he was happy to move into this company that was going to change the world. He had a new employee orientation meeting in the headquarters in St. Louis, and we got up and told his fellow new employees how excited he was and started to recount the words of Robert Shapiro. And after the meeting, he was pulled to the side by a vice president who said, wait a minute. What Robert Shapiro says is one thing. What we do is something else. He's the front man that tells the story. We don't even know what he's talking about. We're here to make money. So he just realized he's just for another profit-driven company that had nothing to do with this bold initiative to feed the world. Now, the experts at Feeding the World scoff at this and know that the GMOs actually reduce the ability to feed the world. They reduce yield. They take money away from more appropriate technologies that do increase yield, like sustainable agriculture, etc. That it's very risky. It takes a lot of money to do, and it also wipes out the biodiversity, concentrates the food supply in the hands of a few multinationals, eliminates farmer independence, and ties up intellectual property and patents, so it takes it out of the common good. So there's all sorts of reasons why it's terrible to feed. It's terrible to use to feed the world. Now, I was at a conference in Des Moines with some of these experts who had done part of this ISTAD report, the most comprehensive evaluation of agriculture in history, over several years, 2,500 pages, over 400 scientists co-authored it, signed by 58 countries, sponsored by UN, etc. And the co-chairman of the report, Hans Herren, who I interviewed as well, he told the whole audience and affirmed what they already knew, that GMOs had nothing to offer to their goals of feeding the world, eradicating poverty, or creating sustainable agriculture. The next morning, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture was there, Tom Vilsack, who had been Monsanto's governor of the year when he was the Iowa governor in 2001. And he was...
Monsanto has a governor of the year?
Yeah, well, anyone, they can give award. Actually, the biotech industry gave the award of the year. He gave Monsanto an award the year before. So, you know how it is.
Cozy.
So I was online to ask a question, and he had gotten applause the whole morning. He was very cordial and very welcoming. And finally, I was the last questioner. And I asked him the question about GMOs, and midway through his answer, he paused and said, a lot of people are concerned about the growing population. And he started to give this party line of Monsanto.
The Shapiro rap.
And what happened was amazing. These PhDs and experts started quietly and then less quietly mooing and hissing.
Oh my God.
It was the first negative feedback he had gotten. And he quickly got himself out of it. He says, well, I'm just telling you what I've heard other people say, and then got out of the subject quickly and took his exit. Now, the next day, he was speaking at the World Food Prize, same city, I was there, and again was spouting the rhetoric of feeding the world, because that was sponsored by Monsanto and DuPont, who owns Pioneer, and Dow, and Syngenta, and Bayer. So it turns out that when he's around the boys, he's willing to spout the rhetoric that perhaps he knows is untrue.
But when he's around the scientists...
he gets nailed.
Very interesting. Will you tell the story, since we're now entering the science portion of really looking at the dangerous effects of GMOs? There was a particular scientist, I believe you were telling me, in England who got a gag order after he came forward. Would you tell us that?
Oh, yeah. This is a great story because...
You're a great storyteller anyway, so it's just perfect that I asked you to do this.
Once upon a time, in Aberdeen, Dr. Arpad Pusztai, world's leading expert in his field, was given...
Doesn't sound British.
No, he's from Hungary originally, but he escaped during the Soviet Union because he wanted to go to a free country. He told me later that what was happening in the science world of UK was far worse than the Soviets, and you'll hear why in a moment.
Yes.
So
because there was money involved.
Yeah, right. He was given a $3 million grant from the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. The protocols that he was going to create were going to be put into EU law so that any GMO introduced into the continent would have to go through his testing protocols. So he took genetically modified potato, which produced a harmless insecticide, harmless to mammals and humans, but not to rats. He had studied this insecticide for 7 years. And he fed this genetically modified potato to one group of rats as part of this preparing of the protocols. Another group were fed non-GM potatoes, another group was fed non-GM potatoes, plus their diet was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato produced. But only the rats that ate the genetically modified potato got sick. Those that ate the non-genetically modified potato that also ate the insecticide, they did not get sick. So it was not the insecticide that caused the problem in the rats. It was somehow
the GMO.
Yes, the fact that it was genetically modified. You see, when you take a gene and you blast it into a plate of cells through a gene gun or infect it through bacterial infection, which is how they do it. Then they clone the plant. They clone the cell into a plant. It causes massive collateral damage. Up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes can change their levels of expression. There could be hundreds or thousands of mutations. And this can create new allergens, like Monsanto's corn has a new allergen that was switched on, contain higher levels of allergens, like Monsanto's soybeans have as much as 7 times.
It can create freaks.
It can create freaks.
We don't really know what it can do.
No, it's a genetic roulette. It's like throwing a domino. It's like
that's your book.
That's the name of the book, and that was where it comes from.
Yes.
So he discovered that these so-called harmless potatoes had caused massive damage to his rats. They caused potentially precancerous cell growth, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, 10 days. It took 10 days to have these effects. Now, he went public with his concerns in an interview on TV with the blessings of his director and was a hero at his institute for about 2 days as the media erupted. Here was one of the leading scientists in the world saying he doesn't think that the population should be treated as guinea pigs, and he wants to see real science on GMOs. Well, 2 phone calls were...
Part of which he was just conducting.
Yes. So he said, it turns out that the show aired on a Monday evening, and on Wednesday morning, he was summoned before the director, who for 2 days had been touting the research as world-class and earth-shaking.
Extolling him.
But the night before, he received 2 phone calls from the UK Prime Minister's office, and that morning, he fired Dr. Proust after 35 years, silenced him with threats of a lawsuit. They disbanded the team. They took away the data. They never implemented the protocols of the EU government. Instead, the Institute, the government, and a whole group of scientists, pro-GM scientists at the Royal Society, underwent a campaign to destroy the reputation of Dr. Proust. Now, he was unable to respond because of the gag order, but 7 months...
So you're saying they also put a gag order on him?
Yeah, he said if he speaks... No, it wasn't a gag order from the court. It was a threat that if anything he said caused economic damage to the Institute, he would be held personally responsible and he could lose his pension, his house, etc. So he was unable to respond, and he had letters to the effect that he couldn't speak. Now, after 7 months, he was invited to...
this is so disgusting.
Well, unfortunately, it's repeated all over the world with respect to GMOs.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen it. It's even got even worse recently in Argentina, where a guy was physically attacked. He had to hide in a car and lock himself in, but his friends, one ended up paralyzed, one ended up unconscious, because he discovered that Monsanto's Roundup herbicide is linked to birth defects. Well, anyway, getting back to Arpad Pusztai, his gag order was lifted. He spoke about what he knew about, finally.
When? How much time elapsed?
7 months.
7 months?
Yeah.
Okay.
And his gag order was listed on February 16th, 1999. Over 700 articles were written within a month in the UK, not in the US, where it was described as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year by Project Censored, but in the UK and throughout Europe, headline news. And that created a tipping point of consumer rejection in Europe because people now knew that GMOs were unsafe. They understood a cover-up was going on. They didn't want to eat it. So Unilever, Britain's largest food maker, publicly committed to stop using GM ingredients in the last days of April, 10 weeks after the gag order was lifted. And within a few days, virtually everyone else followed suit.
They got educated.
Well, they got scared. The consumers got educated.
Yes.
And the food companies realized we cannot sell a GMO in our products or we're going to lose market share.
Exactly.
Tipping point.
And the tipping point was caused because of the education of the consumers.
Exactly. So we've been educating consumers about the bovine growth hormone in the United States. It's injected into cows to increase milk supply, and it increases the amount of IGF-1 in the milk, which is linked to cancer and a higher rate of fraternal twins. It has more pus in the milk, more antibiotics, more bovine growth hormone. And because of consumer education, it's been kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dannon. These brands and most American dairies have eliminated bovine growth hormone, the genetically engineered drug. So now we are engineering a tipping point of consumer rejection against all GMOs. We are educating consumers about the health dangers, and the good news is that the numbers are on our side. So it's
is there anything good, this is going to sound like a funny question, that has been found about the use of GMOs?
Well, if you talk about...
I mean, if a woman wants to have fraternal twins, I guess that's the only thing I could think of.
In fact, the Journal of Reproductive Medicine says that the high rate of U.S. fraternal twins is because, compared to the U.K., is because the U.K. banned bovine growth hormone and the U.S. hasn't. And fraternal twins are not necessarily a good idea for the health of the mother or the kids.
Correct.
But... here's the thing. I'm not against the
I'm
process.
just trying to see some good in this.
Let's review before I talk about the tipping point, and let's say that for the end because that's the good
Let's let everybody know this is Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World on Progressive Radio Network. You are listening to this show with Jeffrey Smith, who is the author of Seeds of Deception and Genetic Roulette. And we're talking about the horrors of genetically modified organisms and the utter importance of educating one and all about them so what happened in Europe can also happen here. We're asking for labeling, and we're asking actually for the utter elimination of GMOs in our food supply, because right now they're rampant and they're doing their dance in our gene pool, and the effects of which nobody yet knows. Why don't we take a moment and listen to a song that you gave me earlier?
Yes, Rob Herring. You're going to remember this name because you're going to want to get it from iTunes after this. Rob Herring. He's got a beautiful song. He actually approached me at a conference and asked me to look at hear this song, and I loved it. So he's just put it up in iTunes. It's called Question What's
Just
Inside.
last week, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's going to give half of the 99-cent download fee to our nonprofit Institute for Responsible Technology to help us in our fight to end the genetic engineering of the food supply, which I'll explain what we're doing about it later. It's good.
Exactly.
But listen to the excerpt of the song. It's a 5-minute song, but we only have 2 minutes right now to listen to. And so, anyway, enjoy it.
Absolutely.
But it's all for the future of the world and the farms we need. What do you think your children are gonna eat when all the food is owned by one company? Once they patented every single seed, I'm not making this up. No, he's not. You can look this stuff up. Yes, you can. But don't pull out your smartphone so soon. Can't you wait till the end of the tune? All the seeds are modified genetically. It'd be nice if we tested them for safety before we start ingesting them thrice daily. But this doesn't seem to be a priority. Yet I see the seeds of disease getting deeper and creeping above my knees. It's freezing, no reason to keep from fleeing. But all I need is what I'm eating. And I'd rather eat it whole. Now refined but natural. The way you find it, how it grows. And I'm aware that there are those who think that this is so ridiculous. But I'ma stick with this. There's so much to miss. We can get through this, but only if we all can take control. If I had the last word, I'd warn you of all the hazards. But these bastards are mastered getting lost past faster before the evidence is explored and not after. So science stays hidden and we're given a disaster. But if enough folks can uncover this hoax, we might be able to expose the dangers of GMOs. And who knows, if we reverse the flow of this trend, it might send them a message, help it come to an end. So help us all out and read about this stuff. Now we might just stand a chance to stand up to the man, or we can all raise our hands and demand some answers. And when we call them bluff enough, they will be peeing in their pantsuits. Cause not one study proves this stuff's safe, and it pains me to face the fact that we won't be able to trace anything back, because the labels will lack the fact that's not accurate.
Wow.
I love that. So here's
I'm going to start singing when you do your speeches.
I know. Oh, dancing. I'm more of a dancer.
Yeah.
So Rob Herring, Herring. You can look him up on iTunes. You can download. It's non-GMO month, so it's a good time to download it and share it with 10 people. Let other people know about it, and if they download it, then every time they do it,
Definitely.
about 50 cents goes to our efforts to end GMOs.
Excellent. And this is GMO month, or non-GMO.
Non-GMO month, thank you.
So we're celebrating here at A Better World.
And that was the first radio airing of that song, by the way, I think.
Is it? All right. Thank you, Rob. And we're glad and honored to be the first.
Now, what I want to do is I want to jump into the guts of things, okay?
Please.
It's like when I talk about GMOs in any conference type setting or public speech, I do a pre and post test, and nearly everyone in the room has decided to become more vigilant at avoiding GMOs after even 15 minutes of some of the dangers. So I'm going to give you just a taste of some of the risks that are in GMOs to give you a sense of why it's a good idea to avoid them.
Yes, and why all of Europe has decided to do so.
Yes. So, rodents fed genetically modified soy, This is reproductive problems. We're just limited to that for now. Changes in the testicles, changes in the young sperm cells. One study showed the testicles changed from pink to blue. Uterus changes, ovary changes, hormones changes in the female rats. The embryos, the DNA of the embryos function differently when the parents are fed GM compared to non-GM soy. One study showed that when mothers are fed GM soy, more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks. The babies were also smaller and could not reproduce, and that was compared to a 10% death rate among the offspring of mothers that were fed non-GM soy. There was a hamster study. By the third generation, most of the hamsters fed...
And since so many humans in power are rats, it's even more relevant.
I'll give you another line about that in a minute. So hamsters, by the third generation, most lost the ability to have babies. It was also 4 or 5-fold rate of infant mortality. Some had hair growing in their mouths. Now, one of the studies was done by a Russian scientist, and she was told that she couldn't do any more studies on GMOs because her boss was under pressure of his boss, the standard story. One of her colleagues tried to comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. She was not impressed. Now, the Austrian government did a study on Roundup-ready corn that was also producing BT, and mice had fewer babies and smaller babies. Now, that's just the reproductive side. Okay, we don't know if it's the genetic engineering, we don't know if it's the extra herbicide Roundup in these crops, we don't know exactly because typically there's no follow-up because the authors are unable to do that follow-up. Now think about the insecticide that is produced in the corn and cotton. It's called BT for Bacillus thuringiensis, it's a particular type of soil bacterium. And they take the gene from the bacterium and they put it into the corn and cotton. So every cell of the plant has a little spray bottle which sprays an insecticide which breaks up in the stomach of certain insects and kills them. And we eat that when we have corn, or some corn. Now,
GMO corn.
GMO corn. The EPA, which has registered these plants as pesticides, said that's not a problem because BT has a history of safe use in a normal bacterial state because they can spray the bacteria on plants. They even do that in organic farming. And that the BT is destroyed during digestion and it doesn't affect mammals or humans. All three of those are false. With peer-reviewed published studies, we know hundreds of people sprayed with the natural BT got allergic and flu-like symptoms. Now in India, thousands of farm workers picking the BT cotton are getting those same symptoms, rashes all over their bodies. We know that mice that were fed natural BT had immune system responses. Now mice that are fed BT corn are getting immune system responses, as well as rats. And we know that it's not destroyed in digestion because we find in a recent study in Canada, 93% of pregnant women had the BT toxin, the insecticide from Monsanto's corn, in their blood supply, and in the blood supply of 80% of their unborn fetuses. Now, where did they get such high levels and such high frequency of intake of BT toxin? Well, the authors claim it was because they were eating the meat and milk from animals that were fed BT corn. Now, I'm not sure if the BT is going to last through that kind of system. But here's what's even worse.
Yes.
The only human feeding study ever published showed that the gene inserted into soybeans, most of it transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside our intestines and probably continued to function. So these folks had Roundup-ready gut bacteria, which means long after we stop eating GMOs, we still have these foreign proteins produced continuously inside of us. Now, they only tested this on soybeans and then they pulled the plug on the research. They never tested this on corn chips. If you eat a corn chip made of BT corn and the gene that produces the BT toxin transfers to our gut bacteria and continues to function, it might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, producing continuously a fresh dose of this insecticide, which may be the reason why 93% of pregnant women had the BT toxin circulating in their blood. So we may be colonizing the gut bacteria of North Americans with these genetically modified genes.
To think that hydrochloric acid, with all of its intense potency, designed by nature herself, is not able to break down these bacteria so that they survive ingestion.
It's sort of like the genes with it. It's not the bacteria itself. It's the genes from the bacteria that's been inserted into corn and cotton.
I see, yes.
But it's close enough.
Still in all, we see that there's something impenetrable in this.
Well, diabolical is a better word, but impenetrable is
Yes,
true.
right, both.
What we have here is a potential catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Now, consider this. They're feeding the products of this infant science to the entire population, putting it into an environment where it can never be recalled, and they're not evaluating to see whether the GMOs introduced in 1996, when 7% of Americans had at least 3 chronic illnesses, were responsible for the skyrocketing of that to 13% in 9 years. They're not looking to see if GMOs are related to the doubling of food-related illnesses between 94 and 2001, or the increase in autism, or allergies, or digestive problems, or reproductive problems that have all been on the rise since GMOs were introduced.
So in short, you're really saying, Jeffrey, that the public health profile of United States citizens changed significantly with the introduction, or within the following years
Yes.
of the introduction of GMOs into the food supply.
No doubt about that. We have the graphs. We see
Yes.
the graphs on the rise.
Yes.
But we don't have...
And there's no other variable that has been able
there's
to be
other variables.
cited.
No, there are other variables because the food supply is under constant attack from industrial agriculture and industrial food processing. So we cannot say for sure that we can isolate the ingredient. Like, for example, many doctors tell me that they prescribe non-GMO diets to patients. So I went and interviewed 7 patients in a clinic in Chicago. Incredible improvements. However, in order to get rid of GMOs, they switched largely to organic, unprocessed foods. Some also cut out wheat and gluten and dairy. So it's like there's cofactors. However, in the same trip, I talked to veterinarians who took farm animals off of GM corn and soy, putting them on non-GM corn and soy, no other changes in the food supply, and they got better. The death rates, the stillborn rates went down, the litter size went up, the overall health improved just by changing from GM to non-GM. I talked to another veterinarian in the same trip, and he talked about pets. He said, cats and dogs, the pets in our home, are the only animals that enjoy the byproducts of the same processed foods that humans eat. It's the same industrial food supply that ends up creating the pet foods as part of that extra waste or so. So he has noticed that when GMOs were introduced, the level of allergies in cats and dogs skyrocketed, the amount of itching cats and dogs. And so when he hears that from his clients and people that write him because he has a syndicated column, he tells them switch him to organic, and the allergies go away.
So there is the appearance of there is a correlation. And
no question of a correlation.
Right, no question about the correlation. And when you start to tinker with it a little bit by making these food substitutes, the way you're saying, to organic
or non-GMO
and non-GMO, the profile begins to seriously change, significantly change. What about cancer? That's, of course, the big bugaboo of our society.
Well, there's a couple of things with cancer. With the rats from the Arpad Pusztai story, you can actually take a look at the proliferative cell growth in the intestinal walls and stomach lining.
That's a great word.
Proliferative, you like that? Well, I call it potentially precancerous cell growth.
Yes.
And we haven't seen tumors in these studies. We've just seen that. We've seen larger intestines, so this is the case in many studies. I think the clearest link to cancer from a GMO would be the bovine growth hormone, and then possibly aspartame, because there's evidence in Europe that rats and others that were fed genetically modified aspartame, it comes from a genetically modified microorganism, that they had tumors in their bodies, and brain tumors have been linked to it in terms of human reports. So as far as the bovine growth hormone, IGF-1 is very linked to cancer. Premenopausal women with high levels are 7 times more likely to get breast cancer, 7 times more likely. Men are 4 times more likely to get prostate cancer. It's linked to colon cancer. And what it does is it increases cell growth dramatically. So if there's a proclivity or a tendency towards cancer, it might make that happen.
It might support it. Since you know as much as you do about Monsanto and the other biotech companies, talk for a moment, if you would, about Terminator seed. Percy Schmeiser up in Canada, you mentioned Canada, and a lot of the studies that have been done there, has been one of those people, in a sense like yourself, who's been very outspoken and public about his position on Monsanto and what they have done to him on his farm in his town, and it's a horror show.
Yeah, let's get to Terminator second, because I think the Percy thing is a perfect way to lead into that.
Sure.
Percy Schmeiser has been saving seeds, getting the best seeds each year for 50 plus years in Saskatchewan, and had a fantastic canola crop that got contaminated by Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. It got contaminated by nearby fields and passing trucks. So now he harvested his field just like he normally does, replanted the seeds the next year that he had separated out, and he got sued. He got sued by Monsanto because he had planted their intellectual property that had come onto his property uninvited.
By the wind?
By the wind, right? So this
happens all over India as well.
Happens all over the world, It's like with the GMOs. It's just,
exactly.
You can't contain them. There's no coexistence that really works.
Sure.
So he ended up being sued, and it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court upheld Monsanto as having the right to sue Percy Schmeiser, and that to confiscate his crops. He didn't have the crops by the time the court case was settled, but to confiscate the crops that had been contaminated. They said it didn't matter if it was wind or insects or flooding, intentional or non-intentional. The way that the patent laws were written, that Monsanto then gained the rights to Percy's crop because wind had carried Monsanto's seeds and pollen onto his fields. Now, the issue is that Monsanto has these contracts that farmers sign where they commit to not saving seeds. It's a lifelong, it's a centuries-old, thousands-year-old practice of farmers saving seeds.
From the beginning of agriculture.
Absolutely. But it's not allowed when you buy genetically modified seeds. And so he had violated the contract and the patent. Now, what the biotech industry really wants to do is to take the contract out and put Terminator seeds in. Terminator seeds are genetically engineered to produce sterile offspring. So when you harvest the canola or the soy or whatever, and you plant it again, nothing will come up. And the purpose of this is to target the 1.4 billion farmers around the world, particularly in developing countries, that save seed. They want to eliminate the practice of seed saving because the seed savers don't give any money to the seed companies like Monsanto, which is the world's largest seed company. And so they want to eliminate this huge diversity, millions of types of seeds out there, and they want to eliminate all that so that the farmers are forced to buy the very few limited genetics available in the catalogs. Now consider this. We're facing climate change. What is the security? What is food security based on?
Diversity.
Exactly. And we have already collapsed that diversity through industrial agriculture.
Monocrop farming.
Yeah. We have over 250,000 varieties of rice before the, quote, Green Revolution. It knocked it down to about 50. Fortunately, Vandana Shiva is saving a lot more, but it's like an absolute catastrophe, an extinction of 90% in some cases of the varieties of fruits and vegetables.
It's the veritable destruction of nature, Jeffrey.
And
it's
now,
really what it is.
The biotech industry wants to take it down astronomically further by eliminating seed saving. And fortunately, the international outcry against Terminator has been sufficient to keep it off the market. But this is what they're willing to, willing to risk the future of life on Earth,
including their own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
However, in the White House, they eat organic. In this and the previous White House, they eat organic, and they don't eat GMOs in the Bush administration White House or the Obama administration White House.
My God. Let's come around. Thank you for that. That really helps to fill out the larger picture. That's very important, because if you're not looking at the seeds, you can't really consider what's then being grown from the seeds. So it covers the whole gamut. Let's get into the labeling issue, which you are so outspoken about, and there is a march that you helped to catalyze beginning in Brooklyn just this past Saturday, marching down to Washington, D.C., over 16 days with a stopover at the United Nations.
Yes, we did the United Nations on Saturday. We left the Flatbush Co-op at about 10 a.m. On Saturday, had a big rally at Grand Army Plaza. A lot of great speakers there.
Gary was there.
Yes, Gary Knoll was there. He was great. He said some beautiful things. Anyway, there's been a lot of support. Dr. Bronner's president was there, David Bronner. He's doing the march all the way to Washington. The head of Rapunzel Chocolate, he actually formed 2 marches in Germany with 8,000 people going 600 or 800 miles. And so he and his crew joined the march, and they brought someone from Italy, and there's someone there there's a Palestinian, there's someone there from Ireland. It's a real international scene. And so I marched with them over the weekend for a couple of days. I still feel it in my legs. And they're going 16 days, and they're ending on October 16th, which is World Food Day. There'll be a big rally in front of the White House. A lot of great speakers. If you're around, definitely go there. It's worth the trip. But you can check also online, and you can pick them up along the way at Right to Know March. Now, the word 2 is actually the number 2. So Right to Know March, RightToKnowMarch.org. You can find out where they are during the next 16 days. Join them for a few hours or a few days. You can camp along the way if you'd like. But on the 16th, which is World Food Day, there's going to be rallies all over the country. So click over from that website or our website, responsibletechnology.org, and go to where you'll see rallies all over the country. And this month is non-GMO month. So you can also go to nongmomonth.org and find other events going on. I'll be speaking in California for 3 weeks, as well as in Seattle a couple of times in the middle of the month. And so we're seeing now a kind of a popcorn effect where people all over the country are getting involved spontaneously. Like, for example, a grandmother in Chico, California, woke up one day and had an epiphany, as she called it, where she said, we need to get a ballot initiative on the California ballot in 2012 for labeling of GMOs in California. And so this was on January 20th when she had her awakening. About 2 months later, after she'd done her research and created a website, she went public, one voice. 6 months later, 70 groups, approximately 70 groups around California had formed to try and make this vision a reality. And so I'm certainly going to be supporting that.
That is so impressive.
Yes, it's fantastic. So labelgmos.org is her site.
So tell what the march is really about because most people don't know that GMOs don't have to be labeled. In fact, Monsanto and their brethren are so powerful in Washington that they have been able to legally mandate the situation where GMOs do not have to be labeled.
Over 50 countries require labeling of GMOs, but not the U.S. And so we can't necessarily tell easily if a product has genetically engineered crops in it or not. I'll tell you how to do it in a minute. There's some tricks, and I'll make sure everyone knows that.
Yes.
Now, the reason why there's no mandatory labeling is, again, the same reason that the GMOs were fast-tracked. The biotech industry has gotten the White House, since the first Bush administration, to continue to order the FDA to promote biotechnology. So the FDA knows that 53% of Americans, the majority of Americans, would avoid GMOs if they were labeled, and that 90 to 95% of Americans want GMOs labeled. But they will ignore 9 out of 10 Americans in order to support the economic interests of 5 biotech companies. And so they do not require labeling.
This is so sick.
However, we're seeing it is terribly sick. So the Right to Know March is demanding labeling, which is the right to know, and in my mind, it's the right to reject and stay healthy.
Correct.
And we're seeing that 15 or so different states have introduced some form of genetically modified organism labeling in the last year, whether it's fish or milk or the GMOs in general. That's never happened before. Now, this is an indication that we're in a transition. We have the makings of a non-GMO revolution.
Yes.
So now, let me introduce how we stop GMOs. This is a very important information that everyone, I think, will be happy to hear, because it's kind of a horror story unless it has a good ending. It has a great ending coming soon.
Yes, fabulous.
All right.
Go for it.
So, now, if we can get Kraft Foods, for example, the largest food manufacturer in the United States, to notice a drop in market share because GMOs are in their products, since there's no consumer benefits to GMOs, they will quickly eliminate GMOs in their U.S. food, as they already have in their European and Japanese line.
Oh, they've already done that.
Yeah, because of consumer concern. So the same companies that sell us GMOs have removed them in Europe, and they're watching closely to see if the anti-GMO movement gains traction. And
so they will take advantage where they can.
Yes. Of course, that's what they do. Now, Once they see a drop in market share where they can link it to GM ingredients are finished. So how many people do we need to show that dip in market share? We think as little as 5%. 15 million Americans. That's only 5.6 million households. Now, how do we get that many people to avoid GMOs? First of all, we have a non-GMO shopping guide, nongmoshoppingguide.com, and an iPhone application called Shop No GMO. And we have a handout you can get. You can download a two-sided piece. You can order the pocket guide and give away lots of them to friends. So we have...
And they can order them on your site?
At nongmoshoppingguide.com.
Got it.
And there's thousands of products that have been enrolled in the Non-GMO Project, which is a third-party verified system for making non-GMO claims. 5,500 products have been enrolled, more being enrolled every day. So we have a chunk of products that people can reliably call non-GMO.
Yes.
So how do we get people to make that transition? If we only need 5%, we can go to people that really want to avoid GMOs and want to know why and want to know how, and we can eliminate GMOs from our food supply without having to convince anyone who's resistant. Because 28 million Americans already buy organic on a regular basis. In fact, 53% of Americans, as we said, 159 million, say they would avoid GMOs if they were labeled. If 9 out of 10 of those are lying, we still get our 5% in tipping point.
Yes.
So we can bring the information to the receptive mothers of young kids, to the doctors and progressive medical establishment, to their patients who are desperate for trying to find what to eat so that it doesn't hurt them. We can bring it to health-conscious shoppers that buy at health food stores. We can bring it to green groups and chefs and religious organizations.
And they're proliferating, actually, across the country.
So what's happening is, we've been working at this. I've been working on this for 15 years, and starting at the beginning of 2010, we have never seen a level of activism as we're seeing now. And by 2011, millions are now engaged. So we have on our site, which is responsibletechnology.org, that's for the Institute for Responsible Technology, responsibletechnology.org, you can sign up for the Non-GMO Tipping Point Network. And join groups in your area or join national groups that are bringing us to the demographic groups that I talked about, like parents and campuses and schools, etc. And you can join the ranks, whether it's a click and send revolutionary where you simply post stuff on your Facebook, or whether you want to show the new film that just came out last week called Scientists Under Attack, which talks about Arpad Pusztai and interviews this guy. He interviews this guy we talked about, interviews a UC Berkeley professor who he was smashed by the probiotic forces when he discovered contamination into the indigenous corn varieties in Mexico. So we have free videos on our site, free articles, free audios. We have all sorts of materials.
Come get educated.
Yeah, you could sign up for the free newsletter called Spilling the Beans. And so we have a whole plan to end the genetic engineering of the food supply, and we welcome people to participate in what is going to be the non-GMO revolution.
God bless. Jeffrey Smith, thank you so much for your excellent work. You are moving this forward like really probably nobody else. I really want to thank you.
It's my pleasure, and I'm glad to bring it to this particular audience, because if there's anyone going to get active, it's this group.
Got it. You're absolutely right. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. Come visit us at our website at www.abetterworld.net and listen to this over and over again and get educated, share it with others. And now, Gary Null for a 2-hour special that you really want to tune into. Thanks so much. I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Good show, fellas. All right. Good. 5 to 6 of our prisoners. Yeah, I know. Sometimes Gary, so good to see you. I like the show. So this guy keeps getting
Come to the Progressive Radio Network each day for the best progressive minds in the world. Here's Here's some new shows coming this month to the Progressive Radio Network. American Jobs Alliance with Curtis Ellis.
The American Jobs Alliance is a movement of Americans from every region, every walk of life, and every political persuasion who believe jobs should be America's top priority.
Fitness Express with Anthony DeMarco.
Each week here on the Fitness Express show, we'll introduce